It's about time to move on to the last speaker of this session, Elliott Stern. Elliott is a writer, lawyer, and independent researcher living in New York City. He's a graduate of Yeshiva University and earned master's degrees in Jewish studies and in philosophy from Yeshiva and from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, respectively. As a student in the Hebrew University, he wrote his master's thesis on the thought of the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Elliott also earned his law degree from Georgetown University Law Center and is a member of the New York State Bar. So Elliott, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, I'm sorry. He's going to give a talk today titled One People, One Language, and a Tower to the Heavens, exploring the story of the Tower of Babel as a cultural legacy. Take it away.
Thanks, I appreciate that. You hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you just fine.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, great. So first I just wanna thank everyone that's listening and thank the organizers for this really interesting conference. Like you just heard, the topic of my talk is going to be exploring the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, the people who tried and failed to build a tower to the heavens. I want to start with what I think is an interesting insight about the Hebrew Bible that was formulated by the German literary scholar Erich Auerbach. Auerbach compared his reading of Homer to the biblical text, specifically to the book of Genesis. And what he observed is that while Homer spells out for the reader everything that he or she needs to know, right? The full cast of characters, the relevant chronology, the full background, and importantly, the didactic lesson to be drawn from the text. He compares this by contrast with the author of Genesis, who includes only so much of the phenomenon as is necessary for the purpose of the narrative. All else is left in obscurity. The decisive points of the narrative alone are emphasized. All else remains mysterious and fraught with background. It's really this idea, this phrase of being fraught with background, that what's not on the page is often as important to interpretation as what is. This really captures what I want to talk about today. The so-called Tower of Babel story from chapter 11 of the book of Genesis is really a kind of a prime example of what Auerbach was talking about. The story is grand in detail, but quite short it's grand in scale, but quite short in detail. It's a tale on the origins and spread of multilingualism, but it's exceedingly parsimonious with its words. And it spawned multitudes of interpretation, all determined to unlock a mystery at the heart of the telling. Yet this text actually, from a syntactic and semantic perspective, is actually fairly simple. The puzzle that confronts the reader is not really about how to parse the words or how to properly translate a difficult phrase, but rather to try to fill in the fraught background, right? It's about understanding what these 9 verses of relatively simple Hebrew are really trying to tell us. What this amounts to, as I hope we'll see in the interpretations I have highlighted here, and we're not going to get to all these, and we'll probably have to run through some of them, but it involves the readers generating for themselves a broad imaginative picture of the life, the circumstances, and even the ideological commitments which they, the readers, take to be animating this primeval story. So let's take a look at the story itself. This is chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, the first 4 verses of the story. You can take a quick read through. The broad strokes of the story are relatively straightforward. It takes us back to a time when the entirety of the land shared a common language and a unifying purpose. Against this backdrop, the story tells of a people, notably not any specific group of people, but rather a group that just migrates from the east, settles in a valley in the land of Shinar, which is ancient Mesopotamia, and once settled, they resolve to construct a city and a tower to the heavens. Then the skies fall. God descends to see the goings-on earth and is not pleased. He foils the building project by a confusion of tongues and proliferation of languages amongst the builders and disperses them to the ends of the earth, putting an end to the great building project. The story ends with a polemic against the city of Babylon, who's a prime nemesis of the people of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, by identifying this city, this ruined city, with the ancient city of Babylon. So I think it's fair to say that the story has a a fairly simple arc and a straightforward etiology. That is the purpose. The purpose of the story is to explain the multiplicity of languages and dispersed settlement of peoples. It's the biblical account of the origins of society as we know it, composed of peoples divided, disparate, divergent, and fundamentally at odds with one another. So where does all the confusion and ambiguity come in? Why is this text so puzzling for ancient readers and for today? You can see here Nissim of Gerona says, it's left us commentators in utter darkness, almost like the blind groping along the wall. And there are many statements like this. What is it about the story that's, creates this puzzle and this mystery? Let's focus in on the middle three verses 4 to 6. And they said, let us build a tower, a city, and a tower with its top in the sky to make for ourselves a name, else will she be scattered all over the world. The Lord came down to look at the city and the tower that man had built. And the Lord said, if as one people with one language, this is cut off, this is how they had begun to act, nothing they proposed to do will be out of their reach. That's really all we're told about what they had done. And the question is, what precisely was it that they had begun to act or that they might propose to do? What is so objectionable about the resolve to build a city and a tower in their newly found valley home that this recently nomadic people becomes the object of God's scorn and sees the end not only of the building project, but their very unity and existence as a settled people? Historically minded scholars have identified generally the tower of our story with the ziggurat, the massive edifice known from ancient Mesopotamia, and in particular, the Edamananki ziggurat of Babylon, which you see a recreation of here. This generally leads to reading the story as an anti-Babylonian polemic as one sort of or another. And of course, there's a lot of merit to this historical approach and many literary approaches as well. But what I hope to show with the various interpretations we'll read is that because this story describes a chapter in primeval human history with an epical time frame, because it has distinct symbols and tropes, this iconic tower to the heavens, the ideas of sin and subversion, the development of language and dispersion of peoples, because it's a biblical story with a lacuna at its center, readers throughout the generations have searched for resolution of the background. Remember, we're trying to fill in that fraught background, which goes beyond the ambitions of literary style or the historical context. What I hope to show is that they see in this brief narrative with these iconic images, they see a vehicle for meaning, a statement, whether it's theological, ideological, or even anthropological, but a statement about the nature of our world, nature of the world and our place in it. And I want to run through a number of interpretations and try to kind of demonstrate this. Let's start with the rabbis. In the Jewish tradition, the rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrash are the biblical interpreters par excellence. They combine a rigorous literalism with a keen sense of broader meaning and narrative. Commenting on the first verse of our story, the rabbis begin by placing in the mouths of the builders a stark challenge to God's supreme rule. Which is more severe? One who says to a king, "It is either me or you in the palace," or one who says, "Neither I nor you will be in the palace." It is the one who says, "It is either me or you in the palace." Generation of dispersion, that's the rabbinic phrase for the builders of the tower, spoke harshly against the one and only God. They said, "It is not for him to choose for himself the upper realms, that is, the heavens, and leave for us the lower realms. Let us build a tower and place an idol at its apex with a sword in its hand, so that will give the appearance of waging war with him, i.e. with God." This type of reading sees in the people's collective resolution to build a tower to the heavens an act of theological aggression, an attempt to usurp and displace the divine throne. For the rabbis, as for many readers to follow, the image of the tower is the central pillar of the story and the essence of its deeper meaning. It is literally and figuratively an iconic representation of the deeper meaning of the story. It is both a physical manifestation of the builder's impiety and a symbol of that impiety itself. On this reading, the thrust of the story takes place along the vertical axis. The dichotomies between the heavens, in Hebrew, shamayim, and the earth, eretz, a term that actually appears 6 times in this very short story, it frames the story. The people seek to ascend to shamayim, while in mockery of the effort, God descends to inspect the tower, which of course remains firmly rooted on earth. The rabbis, I think, are building on the kind of assertive nature of humanity's proclaimed intention. Let us bake bricks. Let us build a city, to the heavens. It's followed and matched by a stark divine declaration. Let us send and confuse their languages. This direct confrontation suggests that the ethos underlying the building of the tower, that is, in unchecked, in uninhibited human ambition, expresses a fundamentally antagonistic relationship between man and God. Now, I should note that while this interpretation of the story has received semi-canonical status in the Jewish tradition, is another strand of rabbinic interpretation, which explains the motivation for building the tower is connected to the memory of the cataclysmic flood in the days of Noah. In this telling, the people fear a repeat of the flood, which they believe was caused by a cyclically occurring rupture in the heavenly firmament, which holds back the waters above. Their solution is the tower of our story. Let's go back to there. It is part of a network, along with 3 other towers from the north, the south, and the west, to be set up around the earth to support the heavenly infrastructure and to prevent another civilization-ending deluge. Now, this may seem almost childlike, right, the idea of supporting the heavens, but this midrash, and there are others in a similar vein, they offer a picture of society that's less prideful than survivalist. It's a portrait of trauma, of people living with the memory of cataclysm and experiencing an ongoing fear of natural extinction, which leads them to take frenzied measures to protect themselves from harm. So that's the rabbis. I want to shift now to a couple of thinkers, medieval thinkers, and what I see is they have a kind of a fresh approach from the rabbis. And of course, all Jewish commentators follow in the footsteps of the rabbis. So any divergence is in some ways a transvaluation of their interpretation of the rabbis. So let's see, starting with Samuel ben Meir. Samuel ben Meir, known by the initials, the initials of Rashbam, is a premier biblical commentator from the 12th century, and he rejects the rabbinic picture of the tower as a symbol of humanity's rejection of divine sovereignty. Instead, what he suggests is that while the sin of the settlers of Shinar does lie in an act of disobedience, the roots of the transgression are to be found in another biblical story. As he says, is rather that the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. This is from the story of creation in Genesis 1. Instead, they chose for themselves a place and said, else we be scattered, right? The quote from our story. And therefore, God dispersed them from there at his command. Rashbam's holistic read connects our story back to the initial charge given by God to man and woman in the story of creation, to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. In this reading, the motivating ideal of the generation of dispersion is the initiative to entrench the human congregation around a single spot on earth, an axis mundi. This is an enterprise which in the eyes of God is contrary to the blessings of creation and in defiance of the divine will. This reading is compatible with the classic image of the tower as a monument elevated above the horizon, a beacon to travelers, migrants, and wayfarers. The symbol of the tower is resituated. It's no longer a tower to wage war on the heavens, but a monument to focused civilization here on earth. Some readers following this vein dispense entirely with the notion of sin as being central to the story. For them, the dispersal of people is not a punishment, but rather a necessary step in the fulfillment of a divine plan for a world populated by different tribes and spread and settled across all regions of the world. Gersonides, for example, offers almost a practical explanation for this divine imperative for man to settle across the expanses of the earth. He sees it as a species survival strategy. After all, he observes, should an earthquake or a tempest or massive floods once again strike the singular spot of human habitation, the human race could be destroyed in its entirety. Hence, the dispersal of the Shinrites from their valley is not about punishment, but it's a story of divine prescience in the face of human provinciality and nearsightedness. The inability or unwillingness to spread around the world is not sin, it's just not wise. It's not a good survival strategy. Another strand of this interpretation by some modern thinkers, have extended this perspective on the text, that it's not really about sin, seeing it as divine foresight and conceiving of what seems to be punitive actions of dispersion and differentiation. It's rather, in their eyes, an affirmation of what we would call today ideological pluralism and heterogeneity. So you have, for example, Shai Held, who has a very interesting essay on the whole story. He concludes his reconstruction of this sin of the Tower of Babel, saying, our story is not about the loss of some primordial unity lost in the midst of time, but on the contrary, it's an active attempt to undo a divine plan for diversity that has already begun to come to fruition, meaning that's what the builders were preventing, the original divine plan for diversity across the world. God's dispersal of people and multiplication of languages thus represented the restoration of blessings already in the process of being fulfilled, an affirmation of pluralism rather than sin. I think we're not going to go too much into depth into the Derrida, which is unfortunate because it's quite interesting, but just for purposes of time, Derrida has kind of a long, dense essay on the tower. It's a very close read of the text. And he actually says, you might know the story, but I suggest you read it again closely. Basically, he identifies the idea of the tower and a universal language with a hegemonic ideology, which needs to be imposed by force. And in this telling, that the fragmentation of language and the abandonment of the tower is an act of deconstruction on the part of God. Right? For Derrida, deconstruction here means something that reveals the contradictions inherent in the idea of unity or universalism or essence or anything like that. So for Derrida, again, we don't have time to go into here, but he has a lot of discussion of the notion of translation and how being divided into languages means the only way we can converse with one another is through translation. Now, this is Derrida, so translation is impossible, but yet this is a state that's preferable to the dangerous idea of a universal language and the violence that's inherent in that idea. Let's move to Nissim of Gerona, a very interesting take. Nissim of Gerona was a 14th century scholar with celebrated philosophical and homiletical writings on the Bible. He has a magisterial essay in our story. And what he argues, let's get up the slide here. What he argues is that what's nominally a story about a people building a city and a tower is actually a profound reflection on the arc of civilization and on the social and political institutions which, however tenuously, allow for the survival of truth in an otherwise hostile world. Like others, he sees the failure to spread out and populate the earth at the heart of the story. By remaining anchored to one plot of land, those who settled in the valley stymied the natural process of differentiation, the emergence of new peoples, new languages, and development of a multipolar political and social order. But he emphatically rejects the idea that diversity or pluralism is to be valued for its own sake. In fact, he insists that the desire to live together as one people is no sin, and he praises the virtues of human fraternity. After all, a tribal world, a divided world, is a world of strife, hatred, and distrust. Still, there is a danger in the long-term trajectory of a monoculture of the sort that the builders try to establish. As you see on the bottom of the slide here, the Blessed Holy One foresaw what the consequences of prolonged human congregation would be. He determined that even if for now it would cause no harm, the gathering itself was bad for them and perilous for the world. As Nissim explains, the danger lies in the suffocation of dissent and the threat to the very survival and even the eventual triumph of truth. As he says, there's no doubt that at the time, all men held defective beliefs, false beliefs, with a few rare exceptions of those who had tasted and witnessed the goodness of the light of the world. Now, he's speaking here of the falseness of idolatry and the truth of monotheism. But I think we can infer a generalized picture, a kind of a social epistemology of how truth can survive even when ignorance is prevalent and persecution is an ever-present threat. As he says, for those righteous individuals who were few in those generations, there's no doubt that the division of the world between nations and rulers was for the good. Why? For when they would be pursued by the people of one particular nation, they could flee to another land where they could pursue the true worship unmolested. What Nissim is describing here is a world of pervasive ignorance and falsehood, in which the fear of the powerful forces the enlightened to pursue wisdom in secret and truth takes refuge in the fissures of the social and political order. This was the threat for Nissim of Gerona that was posed by this great unification plan of the generation of dispersion. If their plan was to succeed and the entirety of the world was to converge into a single unified order under the shadow of the tower, there would be, Nissim insists, no refuge for religious dissenters. And all truth, including the idea of one true God, would be lost forever. So he does see the story about the multiplicity of nations, but instead of seeing diversity as an ideal, for Nissim, he imagines himself into the story. He sees this as a regrettable necessity. He lived in a very difficult time in medieval history. He even talks about how the idea of Jews had multiple countries to hop from one to the other. When one was bad, they would go to another country. When a Christian country was persecuting, they would flee to a Muslim country and vice versa. But the broader perspective, he sees that diversity is a regrettable necessity given the nature of our world and the threat to those dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. One also kind of pessimistic approach, I would say, is the one that's offered by the Spanish-Portuguese philosopher, biblicist, and statesman. He's a long list of titles, Don Isaac Abravanel. He strikes kind of a discordant note on some of the themes that we've been talking about. He imagines the subjects of our story as dwellers in a state of nature, before the hand of man had terraformed the face of the earth. Before, that is, they pushed beyond the natural bounty bestowed on them by God, and beyond, for Abravanel, the ideal conditions for human flourishing. Before this end, they were a single people, living in natural harmony, in that they shared a common language and common practices for all. At that time, all things were shared equally by all because no individual person had private property and nothing private for his own use, because all shared commonly in a collective and used equally among all. By the way, that's Karl Marx. That's not Abravanel, just people who are watching. But of course, this anarchist pre-state utopia was not to last, for human nature reared its ugly head. They were not satisfied with what their creator prepared for them in his bountiful benevolence. They sought to involve themselves and dedicated themselves to discovering new technologies. They engaged in the building of the city and the tower in order to gather there and form a political community, to establish artificial bonds through the establishment of a state. So the building of the tower and the city represents a point of transition from what we might call communal primitivism to a world of complex political, social, and economic relations. In pursuit of wealth, prestige, and creature comforts, the people forsook the simplicity of their pastoral existence for the efficiencies of technology, the cosmopolitanism of city life, and an organized political and social order. But this had a cost. With the advent of trade and private property came the alienation of peoples from their neighbors. With the dawn of organized political life came kings and rulers, hierarchy and the fight for status, chasing after fortunes, and the depravities associated with life in an urban setting, violence, theft, and bloodshed. Now, this commentary, which is kind of dark and pessimistic, I think is actually even more interesting if you know that Abravanel himself served as the royal treasurer to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. In other words, he saw the workings of the Leviathan from up close. And I think we talked at the beginning how people imagine themselves into this story. Seeing the workings of the state from up close, seeing the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, while he was in the service of the monarchs who expelled them and him as well. Perhaps this exposure to the machinery of state inclined Abravanel, who in other writings expresses an anti-monarchist settlement, to idealize a Rousseauian pre-industrial collective ideal and identify our story as the origin story of that society and of its tragic undoing. We're really scratching the surface here. I have more slides I want to run through quickly. I'm cognizant of the time, but I want to get to the visual elements because they're really interesting. Here you see this. This has been the painting that's been the background. I brought it to the foreground here. This is the famous painting of Bruegel the Elder of the Tower of Babel. And just to run through it quickly, there one might say it's about what it really conveys is human futility amidst industrious effort and feverish activity. And the very small details, if you can look at another time, you'll see amazing detail of the ways that people were working and building, the effort that it took to build this tower from the very smallest detail. But of course, tower is never to be finished, right? It's clear to all. It's clear from the painting and to the knowledge of the people who are doing it. There's also an interesting kind of visual essay here on the stratification associated with cosmopolitan life. You see the nobles in the bottom left corner, and in the foreground, the villagers, and lots of little details exemplifying sort of class distinction, which is a broader commentary on the city aspect of the story. We also have this, Bruegel's fellow Dutchman, M.C. Escher, who's the famous graphic artist. This is his wood print on the Tower of Babel, and he utilized the tower as a subject of this drawing to demonstrate those skills for which he's best known, right? The creative use of geometric structures and perspective. In this case, it's the perspective is a bird's eye view, or really a God's eye view of a tower to the heavens. And we're gonna have to skim through the end. I do wanna quickly talk about Babel in fiction. Some of you may know these works, the Library of Babel by Jose Luis Borges. It is in this kind of sci-fi work. The library has stacks and stacks of books containing every possible permutation of all the letters of the alphabet. What this means is that while it's completely random, so while most of the library's books are pure gibberish, it also somewhere on some shelf somewhere contains every copy of every book, not only ever written, but that ever could be written. Or we have the Babelfish of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame, which is a small, bright yellow fish which can translate any language from any species anywhere. And in the words of the narrator of the Hitchhiker's Guide, it's probably the oddest thing in the universe. Both highly recommended reads. We're going to skip through some of these. Let me just mention Kafka, who has also a very, very short story called The Coat of Arms. And the basic message of his message of the story is that for him, that building the tower embodies a constituent element of the modern condition. The paralyzing insight that as knowledge increases exponentially, the work of the present will be overtaken and undone by the builders of the future, and yet the building continues. Right? It can go on and on. There's a great commentary by an 18th century legal scholar and mystic, Jonathan Eibeshitz, who reads the story about a tower built of brick and mortar, and he sees in it a blueprint in the 18th century for a space elevator to the heavens. There's a tremendous amount of creativity, and I've given you just a bit of some of the creative sparks that this story has engendered. I want to end by returning to the rabbis, and this midrash. Speaking about the builders, they'd already been engaged in the building for a very long time, so that they already built the city and the tower they're in, and the tower they're in reached an enormous height. And by the reason of the very great height, it took a full year to carry upwards the stones and the bricks to reach the builders, and thus was done all the time, some going up and others coming down. And so difficult was the ascension and descension that when a brick would happen to fall down and break, all would lament and weep over the great loss. But when a man would fall down and be killed, no one would take the least notice of his death. When we think about the meaning of the story for our own age, with its emphasis today on hyper-efficiency, getting anything we need immediately, the nameless and faceless masses of people who work to empower our society, and everything big, not only big buildings and towers, but the bigness of big data and big corporations and the distance that we often feel from one another. And in some ways, the seeming smallness we feel against this massless society. It might do us well to reflect on the story and to try to hold it up as a mirror of our own society, to understand how the world we live in affects us and how the tower and the city we have built impacts the way we view our fellow human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elliott. That was there's a lot of material there. It's very interesting. Clearly, you could talk about this for forever because there's just so much to talk about, and people also have. There are a couple questions here. The first one is maybe straightforward. Where does the word shinar come from? Is it found in other cultures?
That's a good question. You might have to ask Professor Smith or someone who knows a lot more about this than I do. It's not a Hebrew term. That's certainly the case.
Fair enough. And another similar question: how can we get from the Bible the date where this event was supposed to be? The date when this event was supposed to be.
Sure. So there are ways of trying to work out that the story is actually preceded by one chronology and succeeded by another chronology. But I didn't go into this, but it's pretty clear that this story is kind of an epic in the biblical narrative. It doesn't really connect to what comes before and after. It starts, and the whole world was one people, one language. One scholar says it's almost like saying once upon a time in a land far away. It's not really connected to the birth narrative. And more than that, I think it's intentionally disconnected. It's not supposed to take place in any specific time. It takes place as sort of the mists of our history. I think that adds to the sense that this is an epic story. It's like you can add up the years, and people have certainly done it, but I don't think that's really what the story is driving at.
Right. Yeah, I was expecting something along those lines. We have a question in the chat here. Would you comment on the connection between the command to scatter and fill the earth from the verses in Genesis and the builder's desire to gather? The images of the tower historically seem to suggest height of the tower up to God rather than the gathering of people.
Right, so what I try to show is both interpretations are very pervasive. The idea of a tower to the heavens actually works both ways, because the idea of heavens, Rashbam, who we mentioned, he notes that this phrase, the tower to the heavens, doesn't necessarily have any divine implications. It could just mean he shows other biblical verses say it, which means a really tall tower. Other scholars say, no, this phrase actually is a technical phrase that's used in the broader ancient Near East to signify specifically a kind of a divine height. But I think the story itself, the self-contained story, allows for both readings. The dispersal contrasts well with the height, as well as the kind of like the tower to the heavens. So I think both readings work within the text.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for questions. So thank you again, Elliott, for a really interesting talk. And I will pass things over to, thanks. I'll pass things over to Megan, who will be leading the next session.